You should have died long ago." The voice was not new. It lived in the edges of Ye Wanxing's memories, brittle as old bone, precise as a verdict. She had heard it in another life, shouted across a courtyard as fists landed, whispered while someone counted the seconds until she stopped breathing. For that younger version of her, it had been true. This time, awake on a thin mattress that smelled of mothballs and cheap jasmine, Ye could feel it like a bruise. Her body was borrowed, scarred knuckles, a crooked nose that did not belong to the woman in her head. The mirror over the dressing table showed hair pulled back in a clumsy bun, the delicate crescent scar at her temple like a punctuation mark on someone else's sentence. "No," she told the glass. The word tasted like air. Not this time. The house was a single wide of second-hand furniture and off-brand incense. Her father, Ye Guohua, shuffled by in slippers too small for his swollen feet, eyes permanently calculating losses and possibilities. The woman in the doorway, Lin Man, stepmother in name and marionettist in practice, smiled with all the softness of a blade. "You look terrible, Wanxing. You must be better for the Fu family tomorrow," Lin Man said. She adjusted the embroidered cloth on the train of a wedding dress that hung like a white thread in the corner. "They are important, and this marriage will secure us. You will be grateful." Ye felt the old rage flame up, righteous and righted by memory. In the life she had lived and lost, gratitude had been a narcotic. It had kept her silent while hands took and took, while favors were called investments and her own body a currency. She had died believing there was no exit. She had been taught to accept destiny with bowed head. She would not bow this time. "You think I'm a thing to be bartered?" she asked, each word slow so Lin Man could count the courage. The stepmother's smile stiffened. "It is not like that," Lin Man said, as if every lie had its own careful robe. "The Fu family—" "They are taking me because they need someone small and quiet," Ye interrupted. "Not because they love me, not because they want me. They need a name on paper and a dowry. I will not be their replacement pawn." Her father only looked away. The things his eyes loved were ledgers and the gullibility of others, and he had learned to betray his own house in the small increments of survival. "You don't understand the debt," Lin Man said. "Your share of the dowry alone will—" "I understand the debt," Ye said. "I understand the ledger, but I also understand leverage." For the smallest of reasons, Lin Man's mouth tightened. "You're young. Don't speak nonsense. The Fu are generous. Be humble and grateful, and maybe—" "Maybe I choose what to accept," Ye said, "not you." It was defiance, thin as thread, but stubborn. It was also calculation. She had one advantage most women like her never managed after being traded off: memory. She remembered the hum of city lights in the Fu district, the rumors about project names, stardust, deep sea, that floated like moths in business chats. She remembered, in a way that felt unfair and bright, where she had failed. She would not repeat the same ignorance. They dressed her in the borrowed silk as if the fabric itself could change her fate. The wedding march played in a living room, a tape recorder's tinny approximation of celebration. Neighbors watched with the casual cruelty of people who liked to be entertained by the misfortunes of those beneath them. The groom was a photo clipped to a bouquet, handsome, jawline carved in all the right public relations places. Fu Tingyuan's name was printed on the invitation with a flourish she did not envy. He was the man who had been scheduled to marry her into wealth, into protection, into an identity she never wanted but would have taken if survival had asked. She stood in the doorway, the city rain making the air smell clean and urgent, and she thought of all the things being bought and sold around her: reputations, debts, alliances. She felt for once untethered from the script. If they wanted her to be a martyr, she would make them pay for turning her into one. The news arrived like a cut across the conversation at the tea table. A car had overturned on the coastal road, the groom's car. Witnesses said a truck had swerved. Images scrolled on a neighbor's phone, flashing lights, a crushed front end, bodies covered with sheets. The name tag on the driver's jacket was conspicuously absent in the footage. In the hours that followed, the Fu household flamed into motion, lawyers, chauffeurs, sobbing relatives staged for the cameras. "You should have died long ago," Lin Mon hissed when the phone's glow made her face a sick coin. "You are lucky. Now the Fu family will need someone quickly. The young master is," she swallowed, "he is dead, and they will want to close the wound. They will want a widow." A widow, the word perched between her ribs like a stone. Ye looked at the wedding dress, the silk, damp now with rain, then at the photograph of the groom. The world was a ledger. Someone had written an entry for her, but entries could be contested. If the Fu family needed a substitution, she would not be their easy victim. She would be the one who negotiated. When she arrived at the Fu mansion 4 days later, she was offered a position between marble and frost, not quite family, not quite guest. Photographs of the overturned car printed on every paper. The Fu's grief was a corporate performance, solemn faces arranged like sentries. The matriarch, old madam, sat on a raised settee, eyes like flint buried under powdered skin. "You are Ye Wanxing?" old madam asked. Her voice had the mildness of a judge about to deliver a sentence. "We knew of your reputation. We were told you are small, obedient, a quiet replacement." Ye met the woman's gaze. She kept her voice low and even. "I am not a replacement. I will perform the duties required, but I will not be humiliated." A rustle of surprised whispers from nearby family members, Fu Huaichou and Fu Yuan, the young nephews who always seemed to be half-played with the world, followed her answer. A tall young man, Fu Shengnan, who carried himself like an executive rehearsing dominance, smirked before he could hide it. He stepped forward with the authority that made people mistake confidence for competence. "We must ensure our household's dignity," he declared. "A widow takes certain responsibilities. Tests will be administered to ensure worth." Tests. The word landed on Ye with the weight of centuries. The Fu household's tests were theatrical, ancient rituals dressed in the language of propriety. There was the nail board, a weathered wooden plank rigged with protruding knots that had once belonged to the matriarch's father. The porcelain test, where a delicate plate would be turned in the hands to see who trembled and who did not. And the final, the appraisal of family heirlooms, a ritualized moment to measure who had the eye for value and who was only pretending. Ye had no intention of playing their games with trembling hands. She had an eye that had learned from failure. She had a mind that had been given curiosity by pain. When the nail board was set down in the dim hall where servants paused to watch, her palms smelled of dust and jasmine. She lined herself up, breathed, and placed her hands. The board bit into skin and then into bone in ways that were not meant to be described as brave. Ye counted in her head, 1, 2, 3, numbers as steady as oaths. Muscles protested. A thin line of red grew, sharp but not catastrophic. She kept breathing. Families flinched. The matriarch watched with the measuring look of someone who could always find a weakness to exploit. "Tolerant nerves," old Madam said finally, in some low currency of approval. People who had expected weakness either recalculated or recoiled. The smirk on Fu Shengnan's face narrowed. That night in the opulent guest suite, as lantern light threw gold across silk, Ye sat with a small notebook she had secreted from the borrowed suitcase. In neat, cramped handwriting, she made 2 lists: alliances and assets. The first line under assets read dowry, what she could claim. Under alliances, Shen Feng. Shen Feng was a new presence in the house, a man whose job was to keep the Fu family safe, and whose face had the serene geometry of someone who could be trusted in a fight. He moved like a shadow, with footwear and posture trained to blend in with marbled corridors. At first, he was only an outline in Ye's peripheral vision, a hand at the end of a stick of cane, a guardway that reappeared at the moment someone needed protection. He did not speak to Ye often. Words were not his currency. Action was. There was rumor, always useful in a mansion as full of gossip as the Fu's, that Shen Feng resembled the young master. People whispered because resemblance is a kind of superstition. It lets the bereaved believe a photograph could be a living man. The rumor made everyone deferential or nervous in equal measure. Eyes lingered on Shen Feng longer than courtesy called for. Friends of the family gasped to see his profile and then shrugged it off, as if the same face could exist twice in a world that preferred authenticity. Ye noticed him because he did not watch her with pity, and because his temper was short with the ones who tried to make a spectacle of her. When a cousin at dinner, wine-slick and smirking, suggested Ye should be grateful for any roof over her head, Shen Feng's napkin folded into a knife between his fingers. He did not speak, but his jaw tightened like a trap. "You are too outspoken for someone in your position," the cousin said. It was meant as a rebuke. "You are too predictable," Ye replied. It was meant as a counterblow, and landed on a silence that had the reverence of broken glass. After dinner, a servant tipped Ye with a half-joke. The dowry chest had arrived at the gate, and old Madam had ordered it opened under supervision. Something inside the rough-grained chest had glinted against the inner fabric, an object wrapped in a velvet that smelled faintly of camphor. The chest was displayed in the morning room like a relic. Family members made a ceremony of inspecting each item while old Madam watched, knitting her approval into the air. The dowry was less generous than Ye had hoped. Her father had sold much of what could have paid the household's debts. But tucked in between layers of embroidery and a folded letter of wishful provenance, Ye found the pendant. It was a small carving of a Keelan, the fabled beast whose legacies said it chose virtuous households. The pendant was old, its jade clouded at the edges, but when Ye cupped it in her hand, it seemed to catch the light differently. The matriarch frowned. "This is a family heirloom," she said. "It should not have been sold." "I noticed an old repair," Ye said before she could stop herself. "A missing clasp, a rethread. Whoever had it last might have replaced the chain." There was a ripple of surprise. To be young and to speak of restoration was a kind of impertinence in a house that valued lineage over curiosity. It also revealed something the Fu family had not expected. Ye had an eye for things other people overlooked. The matriarch tapped her fan, a discreet sound that demanded answers. "You have experience with antiquities?" she asked. "A little," Ye answered. She kept her tone neutral because flattery was a currency she had no intention of spending. "Not expertise, but I can tell the difference between a mend done by a clumsy craftsman and one done to conceal a deeper flaw." An auditor from the family, Mr. Zhang, full of the easy arrogance of men who had money in offshores and opinions in equal measure, laughed once like a pistol. "We didn't bring you here to dress in old stories," he scoffed. "This is a house of business now." "Then let business decide." Ye's voice folded into a calm that had less to do with courage than with computation. "If the pendant has been altered, it may have been to hide a mark. A mark might indicate belonging to a sub-branch or a buyer." Old Madam's eyes lingered on Ye a fraction longer. Families like theirs loved heirs who could see a market, who could turn an heirloom into a ledger entry. It was not sentiment, it was utility disguised as tradition. At evening's end, when candles guttered and family members wandered away, a servant came to Ye with a small box she claimed had fallen out of a chest liner. It was not a family trick, it was nervousness. People presented small offerings as apologies when they had sensed the shift of winds. Ye accepted the gift, an old-fashioned USB drive, its casing scratched but intact, a tiny carved tag still grimed with unknown fingerprints. "A strange trinket," the servant said, voice lowered. "Found in the dowry chest. The master's staff said to bring it to you." Ye turned it over. A tag carved with a subtle Qilin motif matched the pendant's symbolism. On the casing, someone had scratched 3 letters, D-S-D, so faint they were almost invisible. Deep sea? Stardust? Names she had heard in boardroom rumor, project names whispered at the edges of coffees and trade lunches. Had this small, anonymous thing been meant for safekeeping and embroidery? Had someone hidden it because they feared eyes? Shen Feng appeared at the doorway, as if conjured by thought. He took in the room. The box, Ye's hands, the way the candlelight made small geography in the creases of her face, and nodded once, in that way of his that meant acknowledgement without intrusion. "You should hand it to the family," he said. His voice was rougher than the rumors. "Or keep it safe. Either way, be careful." "That is what I intend," Ye said. "I will examine it." Shen Feng's gaze flicked to the pendant sitting on the dressing table, and for a moment something unreadable shifted in his face. The resemblance, people said, had a strange weight. When he looked toward the pendant, his profile softened, in the way a photograph softens when changed by memory. "Do you know how burdened such houses are with secrets?" Shen Feng asked quietly. "They preserve them in plain sight." Ye gave him a smile in return, not gratitude, but recognition of an ally who did not promise rescue. "I know how to count secrets," she said, "and how to make them worth something." Night wore her like a cloak. Dreams visited, a combination of scenes she already knew and possibilities she had not yet dared assemble. She dreamed of the car overturned in the rain. She dreamed of Fu Tingyuan stepping out of the wreckage like a trickster. She dreamed of a boardroom where a blank screen displayed the name of a project and the word "authorized" beside it. The next morning, word traveled through the household like a hidden current. The Fu family had convened a meeting with their legal counsel. Old Madam's face had the calmness of a woman arranging a chessboard. The family gathered in a long room where portraits watched and where the air smelled of old money and newer ambitions. "The board will soon meet," Fu Shengnan announced from his place at the head of the table, the posture of someone practicing the most important of lies, authority. "With the heir gone, we must ensure continuity. The signature of the late master is still honored on many projects, but some require an internal key. Those keys cannot leave the house. We decide who acts until a formal head is named." Silence, as calculated as the announcement, fell. Yi listened. Keys, projects, signs she had begun to recognize as axes on a new map. If she could find a way to lay her hand on the right leverage, on an object or document that bestowed the right to steer a project, she could make the family need her more than they wanted to use her. Old Madam's eyes found Yi. "You came to us as a widow," she said. "A widow performs duties, but if you have wit and discernment, family loyalty will follow. We will not throw away this house's honor." "You do not own my honor," Yi answered. The sentence surprised even her with its fierceness. That afternoon, she asked, politely, to see the dowry chest again. There was a tangle of protest, of protocol, and spectacle. Old Madam permitted it with a hint of amusement. The chest had been opened and catalogued, presumably for show, but in the private corners of the house there are always things that fail to be seen by the great lights. When Yi unwrapped the velvet, she found the pendant and, under a ribbon, the USB drive's casing. The casing was heavier than it looked. Once freed of ribbon and velvet, it seemed to have been carved to fit a finger. On its side, someone had engraved a number sequence, the kind of code a family might use to mark legal items. Yi lifted it to the light and felt the gravity of it, the way leverage sits in the palm like a cold coin. It had belonged, she realized, with the slow, satisfying click of a puzzle fitting, more to business than to ornaments. Word travels in mansions in two ways. First, as formal announcements. Second, as rumors whispered at the edges of a servant's tea. By nightfall, a soft rumor made its way through the marble halls. The widow had found something. Eyes that had been indifferent before now registered her in micro-expressions that read like balance sheets: potential asset, unknown liability. Fu Shengnan summoned her to a small antechamber. His face was harder than usual, an attempt at corporate composure. "You have a way of surprising us," he said, "but do not mistake openness for weakness. If you intend to stake a claim in matters of property, be warned, the family will resist." "I only intend to protect what I brought into this house," Yi said evenly. "The dowry is mine. I will not let it be used to feed debts." "You think in terms of assets," he said sharply, "but assets are meaningless without authority." "Yes," Ye replied, "which is why I intend to trade one for the other." He laughed then, a brief sound like a knife hitting glass. "And what can a widow trade? She trades bitterness for a name. She trades obedience for silence." "You trade for what others want," Ye said. "I will show them I understand their desires." Later, when she shut her door and let the silk fall from her shoulders, she turned the USB over in her hands until the metal worn grooves fit the map of her fingers. The tag's carved qilin matched the pendant, the tiny scratch of DSD like a fingerprint across the casing. Her mind slid into the arithmetic she had been taught by Payne. If she held proof of an asset that could unlock a project, then she could become the fulcrum during the family's hour of instability. She could be necessary. There were risks. The Fu family had its power centers, and those centers did not welcome outside hands meddling. There were men who could twist laws, who could plant evidence, who could use a woman's past as a weapon. Ye had seen such men once. She had learned that power did not always find the truth. Sometimes it invented it. Sometimes it manufactured the death of those who sat in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she had memory now. She had an inherited instrument in her palm. She had Shen Feng's quiet acknowledgement, which mattered more than any oath because it could convert to action. The following days were a study in performance and exam. The house watched her with calibrated disinterest. The staff waited for her to falter. The matriarch invited Ye to an antiques appraisal, a public test that doubled as entertainment. Experts came with crates and pedigrees. They spoke in the private codes of collectors, citing regions and glazes, identifying the whirls of age on pottery as if they were handwriting. Ye stood beside the matriarch and listened. The expert's jargon was not impossible to learn. Nuance had always been easier than the brutal facts of men. She asked one expert a question about a kiln technique he had mentioned, just one, and the man's smile stiffened. He had expected sycophancy and got curiosity instead. "You have an eye," the matriarch said afterward, with the cool pleasure of someone who had been entertained. "You see detail where others see only price tags." "I see worth," Ye corrected. Worth, the two words were not the same. Her small public victories earned her minor allowances, a seat at lunch where she used to stand, an invitation to listen in on a family meeting, the old privilege of being near people who held more. It was not power yet, it was access. Shen Feng escorted her through corridors that smelled of polished wood and old tobacco. "Be cautious," he said once, voice low. "They will test you in ways that have nothing to do with decorum." "I've anticipated that," Yi replied. "You did not die this time," he said, almost as an observation of fact, not pity. "Alive is inconvenient for some," she said, "but useful for me." He watched her for a long moment, as if considering whether her calm was the result of bravado or strategic grimness. Then he did what he had done before. He did not dominate, he guarded. When she entered rooms now, his silhouette was a constant at the edge of her sightline. He was not a lover, he did not promise to save her. He was a protector with a code of his own. On one afternoon, a courier arrived, someone who moved with the certain briskness of men accustomed to moving important cables and documents. He carried papers for the young master's office, transfer requests, project memos, contractual appendices. Among them was a single sheet with a typed list. Project Deep Sea, authorization required, key DS04. Yi caught her breath like a bird coming to shore. The paper was banal, bureaucratic, but bureaucrats build cathedrals out of banalities. Keys could be literal. They could also be digital authorizations, a string of symbols that unlocked a vault of data or an account. If Deep Sea was a project whose signatures now lack a named heir, an internal key could be the only thing that allowed the firm to proceed. It was exactly the kind of leverage she needed. She held the paper like a map. Her plan was simple in its brutal arithmetic. Hold the key and you become indispensable. Hold the key visibly in the house where power squabbled, and you could bargain for protection, for shares, for an official role that could not be shrugged off without the world seeing. She would not romance the idea of revenge, she would convert it into strategy. But plans do not exist in a vacuum. Fu Shengnan noticed the way a courier lingered at her door. He noticed the hush in his mother's voice when papers were mentioned, and he stitched together a narrative full of the assumptions his privilege allowed him to make. "The widow is ambitious," he said to a cousin over brandy, whose smoke masked the edge of the question. "We should monitor her. If she tries to enter the board's decisions, she will destabilize everything." "Or," the cousin said, leaning in with the cruel little smile that belongs to men who like to write the ends of other people's stories, "she might be useful. Let her find the key. Then we will see how she handles the consequences." Consequences were a different currency. Yi had not yet spent the one she held. She walked into the library with the USB tucked into the lining of a sleeve and sat with her notebook. The house moved around her like a slow machinery of assumption, and under the ticking she began to write in the cold ink of new intention. Allies to cultivate, Shen Feng, the matriarch's old steward, a young director ambivalent about Shangnan's aggression, enemies to watch, Fu Shangnan, Lin Mon, perhaps her own father, objectives, secure project authorizations, make the family need her, convert dowry into documented leverage. At the bottom of the page, she wrote 3 words and then circled them: trade name for authority. The rest of the day she walked as if holding a spark. It was a dangerous thing to carry. It could burn, or it could illuminate. In another life, she had been given no chance to choose how to be claimed. Now, the fate that had once been decided without her was a subject to negotiate. That night, as rain started again, an irony she did not bother to observe, The sound of footsteps outside her door stilled. A young nephew slipped an envelope beneath it, childish handwriting giving way to something less assured. For the first time since she had been dragged from the stairwell life of her first death, Ye felt the old map shift. She could picture negotiations, not as pleas, but as calculations. She could see the exact moment when a family would have to decide whether to protect their name or their profits, and she could place herself in the threshold of that choice. When the day closed, Shen Fang found her in the garden. Moonlight silvered the leaves. He did not speak at first. He merely stood and let the quiet be a thing between them. "You will need allies," he said finally. "Not many, but the right ones." "I have begun to make a list," Ye answered. He smiled, something almost like approval softening his hardened edge. "I will be one of them," he said. "But I am not your shield to hide behind. I will not take your blows for you." "I don't want you to," Ye said. "I want you to stand with me." He nodded. There was a reluctance in him that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with the promise he carried. Protectors are often craftsmen of restraint. Ye understood restraint because it had been the only language left to her when survival had been a practice in smallness. The house, meanwhile, had begun to turn things against her in smaller ways. A cousin found a way to suggest that her family had been irresponsible in their finances. Servants dropped hints about debts unpaid. A whisper reached her ears that someone in the Fu inner circle believed the dowry had not legitimately been hers at all. They would test her patience in public and her credit in private. Ye would need to convert the asset she had into evidence of worth that could not be dismissed by gossip. She slept that night with the USB under her pillow and a blueprint of possibility in her head. The plan required care. She would not simply reveal the key like a talisman. She would stage its value, make the family understand that without its consent, the projects they had fought for would stall. She would make being her ally appear more businesslike and less emotional, less shameful and more necessary. She would make them fear the cost of losing momentum. The next morning's sun came up on a household whose equilibrium had already begun to wobble. A courier arrived with a terse note from Mr. Chen, representing a potential land deal that the Fu family had been courting. The letter noted a tight deadline. The project required authorization that would normally carry the late master's seal. Time, the letter implied, was a currency, and no one would wait forever for grief to cool. Old Madam, flanked by advisors, looked at her as if for prophecy. "You understand business?" she asked. "I understand the cost of delay," Ye replied. "If the project stalls, it will cost us more than money. It will cost reputation. If the family cannot sign on it day to day, others will build it instead." Fu Shangnan bristled at the implication that he might not be able to rally signature and force. He was used to being the person who did not need to be needed. His posture was of one who holds direction like a baton and expects it to be obeyed. Ye watched him with a patience that made small chess moves seem like prayers. She watched the way his hand tremble a fraction when the steward mentioned the tight deadline, and she filed that observation away like a receipt. If she showed Old Madam the USB's tag, if she suggested the key's existence without letting anyone know she possessed it, she could create a shared recognition of dependency. She could set up a negotiation where her terms were the only ones that made sense. The family met that evening in the study. Mr. Zhang placed his hands over a ledge and spoke of markets. "We cannot let sentiment slow us," he said smoothly. "If the Fu Group stumbles in this quarter, it will be our competitors who laugh last." Old Madam steepled her fingers. It was an invitation for consensus, not argument. Ye cleared her throat. Her voice was small in the high-ceilinged room, yet it carried. It was the voice of someone who had practiced speaking when no one wanted to hear her. If the authorization requires an internal key, the family must designate who holds that key, she said. If no one is authorized, a project like Deep Sea will halt. That halting is what other people will exploit. Silence returned. Fu Shanglun's jaw worked. Old Madam's eyes flicked like a hawk's. The room suddenly felt like a courtroom where every silence was a verdict being negotiated. You propose an interim, Fu Shengnan said. We cannot appoint a stranger to hold strategic authorization. You wouldn't call me a stranger if you knew how it had been kept before, Ye said. You would at least wonder who hid what and why. Her words had the effect she intended. They seeded suspicion. For a house like the Fu's, suspicion is the most dangerous kind of currency. Once it is public, even if it lacks foundation, people will act as if it were true to protect themselves. That night, after the family dispersed and old Madam retreated to her private chambers, Ye returned to her small sitting room. The USB sat on her palm like a future she had yet to spend. Her fingers traced the initials and the tiny chip of a Keelan. It was, in the logic of corporations and families and greed, a key. But she also knew that keys double as targets. There were men who would kill for footprints on a ledger. There were men who would invent reasons to send a woman back to the staircase if she got too clever. She had lived the consequence of being seen and not believed. She would not repeat the mistake. Her plan, now formed into a series of small, stubborn movements, required allies and patience. It required the right moment, the right audience. It required collecting proof, not rumors, and it required Shen Feng. When he came to the door, quieter than the weather, he did not ask her what she planned. He stood with the patience of someone who knew what watchfulness meant. Keep it secret, he said, not because secrecy is noble, but because our enemies are quick to stab. Keep it secret, he said, not because secrecy is noble, but because our enemies are quick to stab at what they cannot hold. Ye looked up from the paper on which she had drawn arrows between names and projects. The USB sat warm in her palm, a small, hard thing that felt larger than it should. I know, she replied, and will be deliberate. Shen Feng's jaw was a square of resolve. He did not offer promises he could not keep. He offered steadiness. Then be careful when you make yourself necessary. Necessity makes people greedy. Greed makes them cruel. She folded her fingers around the USB as if to remind herself it had weight beyond its metal. Then we make them need something they cannot get without us. They spoke in whispers because the house itself had ears, walls that listened, servants who liked to be seen as the first to notice. Outside, the rain ticked on marble and eaves, filling in the silence with something that was almost accompaniment. Inside, Ye began to plan the first move of a negotiation that would be reason first and bravado only later. 2 days after the courier's list, the mansion received a formal notice from Shangxi International. An emissary would arrive that week to finalize the joint venture for coastal development, if the Fu Group could provide immediate authorization. The emissary's letter was polite and economically terse. It did not mention feelings or condolences. It mentioned schedules and legal penalties and the risk of overseas investors losing patience. Ye sat in the study and watched the way the matriarch's eyes settled on the paper. Old Madam had always known how to listen to letters. They spoke of money in a way eyes could translate into the sound of silence that comes before a chess move. Yi let that silence fill, and when Old Madam looked up, Yi spoke. If you hesitate, Mr. Chen will not wait, Yi said. Her voice was even. Shangxi will find another partner. The project moves without us. If you value reputation or profit, you should not delay. That night, Old Madam asked Yi to sit with her in private. The matriarch's sitting room smelled of tea and lacquer, a scent that had always meant judgment. For a moment, old Madam said nothing, just watched the widow with a face that had been trained for decades to find leverage where others saw only grief. "You understand the family's operations more than you let on," old Madam said quietly. "You speak of delay as if you had half a ledger in your head." "That would be inaccurate," Yi answered, "but I do understand incentives." Old Madam tapped the arm of her chair. "You have been useful." Yi's pulse did not race. Utility had been money's language to her since she could remember, but utility could become position if managed. "I intend to be more than useful," she said. "I can ensure projects continue. I can protect assets. I can be practical." There was a pause, almost like a balancing, and then old Madam nodded. "Very well. If you can produce authority for the deep-sea project, the board will have to accept a temporary actor in the heir's stead. We will not be defeated in business because the family chooses grieved protocol." The matriarch's tone was not tenderness, it was precedent. For someone like old Madam, precedent spoke louder than sentiment. Yi answered with the only thing that had stopped men like her in other houses: clarity. "I have a key to deep sea," Yi said. She set the USB on the table between them like a small, insolent thing. "I do not propose to frighten you. I propose a trade. Let me act as the family's interim steward for the project. In exchange, protect the dowry, and—" "Your family's honor?" Old Madam's eyebrows rose, not unkindly. "In exchange for legal protection and a seat at the interim table," Yi corrected. "Not because I desire titles for vanity. Because if we stall, projects will be lost. If we move, we will generate profit and guard reputation. That is what I trade. A role that ensures continuity in exchange for formal recognition of what I brought here." There was a long moment as old Madam considered the simplicity of that bargain. She had seen the way negotiations fracture into pride, and she had lived long enough to prefer tidy instruments of power. "You ask much," she said. "You ask what is necessary," Yi replied. Old Madam's verdict was a quiet thing. "We will present the board with the authorization of an interim steward for deep sea," she said. "You will be allowed to sign until a formal heir is appointed. But we will also monitor. You will be observed. Observed." The word carried the thin pretense of oversight, but also the backing of one who could wield surveillance. Yi accepted the terms. It was not a victory wrapped in immediate applause, but it was a toehold. Word of the matriarch's arrangement leaked in measured portions. The family needed to appear unanimous, but the corridors were quick to gossip. Fu Shengnan's face did not improve when he heard the whisper of Yi as interim steward. He had expected someone pliant, someone who would vanish like a reed with the turning of a wind. Instead, the widow had placed a chip of leverage between herself and the house. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday. The room itself was a glass-walled theater, city light cutting into it like sharp blue knives. Executives sat in lever-backed chairs, the mechanical clicking of pens making a low rhythm. Yi entered with old Madam's escort and sat at a smaller table to the side, nominally as an observer, practically as the wielder of a potential authorization no one else had. The vote came down to a tie. The late master's vote, obviously, could not be accounted for, and the family's elders were split between tradition and the market's ruthlessness. The company bylaws allowed for an interim steward to be appointed when the heir was unable to perform, provided a majority agreed. With family tension and external pressure, the board split reflected real fear. Rules are only effective when people will enforce them. Yi had considered that when she had agreed to old Madam's arrangement. She had a backup, the nephews Fu Huaizhou and Fu Yuan. They were young, not yet calcified by power, and the young at times favored novelty. Yi had spent casual hours listening to the brothers talk idly in the garden. She had let them say foolish things. She had even joked with them, letting small threads of trust grow. Those threads now mattered. At the moment the board's chairman called for the vote, Yi felt a weight in the room like the hush before a verdict. The cameras outside hinted at the public interest in the result. A corporate world held its breath. "And the tally is," the chairman began, but he did not finish the sentence aloud. Votes were entered by a panel. The board's screens ticked as names lit: for, against, abstain. The chairman's hand hovered. It was a tight tie. The algorithms that controlled corporate signaling had little appetite for indecision. Yi felt her skin tighten. A minor voice in the room, a legal advisor, murmured that without a clear majority, the project would be delayed until an heir was named or an emergency committee formed. Time was money, money was noise. Yi had contemplated direct action, presenting the USB and demanding recognition there and then, but that would have been crude and would have invited legal challenges. Instead, she leaned forward and spoke softly, sparing no one the clarity she now used as a weapon. "If the project halts, it will cost us a competitor's gain," she said, voice steady. "It will cost the Fu Group's reputation. That cost will be immediate and measurable. If you wish to avoid that, to maintain continuity until a formal heir is selected, appoint an interim steward with the authority to sign on behalf of the house for Deep Sea." It was not an order. It was an equation. The room reacted not to her title, but to sense. Decisions in that space were ledger entries in human form: loss, risk, benefit. The chairman glanced at old Madam, who shook her head almost imperceptibly in Ye's direction. Then the vote resumed. This time, the screen clicked and nudged differently. The bar lights moved. Voices that had once been hesitant chose the practicality of profit over the aesthetics of tradition. The younger members, including Fu Huaichou and Fu Yuan, pressed the voting buttons that made the tally tilt. The result? A narrow majority in favor. Ye felt a small, incredulous exhale leave her body as the room acknowledged the interim authority. She was not the official heir. She had no permanent title. But in that moment, her hand on the USB became a key not just to a project, but to a story that could be told publicly. The widow who had kept a project alive while the house grieved. The win was immediate in its impact. Shangxi's emissary signed documents with the house's interim steward. Mr. Chen accepted a scheduled meeting, choosing to keep the deal with Fu Group rather than seek alternatives. The market quieted with the sound of relief that sounded, externally, like competence. But power provokes retaliation. It was predictable. When men who have always had their way suddenly find necessity favoring a newcomer, they look for reasons to delegitimize the newcomer. Fu Shengnan, stung and not subtle, moved in the shadows he knew well. He began to cultivate stories that could be whispered into the ears of the press or presented as concern in board meetings. He planted hints of impropriety, suggestions that Ye's dowry had hidden liens, that her family had questionable creditors, that her sudden rise was the result of an arrangement with unknown parties. He paid for minor audits to be rerun, not for the sake of clarity, but for the spectacle of doubt. Ye met these slings not with melodrama, but with documents. She had kept meticulous notes. She had receipts. She produced legal records that showed the dowry's disposition. She arranged for audited confirmations of financial flow through neutral parties. Shen Feng accompanied her to meetings with lawyers and trustees, a solid, silent presence. His eyes, when he looked at her, spoke of something quieter than romance, a confidence that what they were doing was right and that he would stand while she negotiated. But suspicion does not always need paper. It can be manufactured with the right actors. Fu Shengnan turned to darker methods, smear campaigns orchestrated through social feeds. An old friend of a cousin paid to plant a false rumor. The rumor suggested that Ye had been seen leaving the mansion with an unknown man late at night. Nothing explicit, but enough to feed the tabloids. It was a small, cold weapon. Ye shrugged at the headlines. Rumors tire quickly, she told Shen Feng. They are loud because they are empty. He did not smile. Empty things still make noise, he said, and noise attracts opportunists. The real escalation came when an attempt was made on Ye's reputation more directly. It was a calculated, predatory play, an attempt to craft an image that could be photographed and shared, a staged scene implying impropriety. The plan was clumsy in its cruelty. A director in the company, encouraged by Shengnan and bribed by promises of promotion, arranged a meeting with Ye under the pretext of discussing a press strategy. Director Su was affable, patting his pockets, offering wine, and smiling with the practiced ease of someone used to compromise. Ye recognized often the signs of predatory meetings: flattery, isolation, a slow narrowing of exits. She did not enter alone. Shen Feng suggested a neutral assistant attend, and Ye had asked old Madam's steward to be present at the periphery. But the director's plan was to drug a drink and insinuate a compromise that could be photographed, allowing a setup to be made for a public scandal. Shen Feng watched the meeting like a hawk. He kept to the edges, making mental lines between exits and shadows. Ye watched as well, with the coolness of someone who had spent too many nights learning how to react 2 steps before an assault. She had her own defenses: a careful refusal of toasts, a measure of how drinks were accepted, and a watchful mind that tracked the body language of everyone in the room. The assailants were sloppy. The drink was spiked not with subtlety, but with haste. When Ye raised the glass to her lips, only to feel the edge of an odd sweetness, she allowed the motion to pause, mimicking drunkenness if necessary, but not swallowing. She had learned the hard way to trust nothing unlabeled. It was a small, dangerous moment in a room that could have been a disaster. The director's hand trembled in the way a guilty man's does when pretense slips. Shen Feng chose that moment to step forward, to ask a sudden question about a clause in the press release. The director turned, and in that instant, the camera that had been hidden on a shelf never had its intended shot. "You are clumsy," Shen Feng said softly, without accusation. He did not move to make a scene. He simply walked toward the exits, a silent force. His approach changed the anatomy of the room. Shu stammered. He could not complete the choreography of deception with an audience at the door. Another accomplice, someone in the corridor, was already composing a text to a photographer, but with Shen Feng's presence, the confidence flickered. They retreated, but the intention had been set. Ye filed the incident with the matriarch and instigated a formal complaint. It required careful handling. Exposing a plot could escalate to violence. Ignoring it could cost her reputation. Ye chose to document everything. She summoned witness statements, held back her own public fury, and allowed the legal apparatus to move. But fear is clever. When one attempt failed, Fu Shennan chose another method less obvious but more dangerous: poisoning through a trust object. Someone sought to tamper with Ye's night regimen. A servant was paid to plant something in her nightly tea. The attempt was more direct than before: a violation in the night, designed to create physical collapse that could be used to question her sobriety, her mind, her fitness to hold responsibility. This time, Shen Feng was not close enough to intercept. He had been dispatched to handle another crisis. A forged email to Mr. Chen meant to make the land deal fall through. When he returned to find Ye pale and collapsing in her suite, the sight was enough to make even his restraint crack. Ye woke to the sensation of hands that were not rough but were insistent, a cool cloth on her forehead, and the quiet metallic smell of antiseptic. For a flash of terrified time, she felt the old horror she had escaped, the feeling of being taken while conscious. She did not speak, she simply listened to the measured phrases of those around her. Shen Feng's presence was immediate and salvational. He had been faster than it looked. He had cut across the mansion with a single purpose. He would later tell no one how he had intercepted the poisoned infusion, only that he had found the traced route and the accomplice who had been paid out of a small vault under a table. The servant implicated confessed under the pressure of confronting the matriarch and her own conscience. The confession was shaky. It named names. It spoke of money passed quietly, of late-night envelopes. The matriarch, who had ruled the house with a millennial patience, acted with a swift decisiveness. She convened the household and presented the evidence she chose to make public: a coerced servant, a director's suspicious solicitations, and the pattern of intimidation. The family responded with a chorus of protest. Some feigned shocked outrage at the suggestion that one of their own could behave so. Others, who had been allied to Shengnan, found themselves desperately rearranging their stories. In the aftermath, legal action was necessary. Ye did not indulge in theatrical revenge. She did not seek to watch men fall. She sought only the documentation that would protect the projects she had helped secure and secure the household's public reputation. Evidence was gathered, witness statements formalized, and the police, when involved, were given only the kind of statements that would be usable in court. Yi had learned in 2 lives that the law could protect, but only if its machine had the parts assembled with a care that accepted small truths as a foundation. The plot to discredit and silence her had not succeeded, but it had reminded everyone of the lengths to which power would go. The scandalous night also forced a complication Yi had not intended. Images leaked of her that had been staged to embarrass, photographs taken in the hallway, blurred and promising scandal without content. They were spread through social feeds with manufactured captions. A few journalists, smelling a click, posted without verification. The boards at some rival companies quickly turned such attention into campfire talk. Fu Shangnan watched the narrative with a viscous delight. Yi went to the matriarch and asked permission for nothing and for everything. "Expose the trail," she said, "not for revenge, but to deter them." Old Madam agreed. They would hunt the thread and pull until the web unraveled. That required patience, witnesses, and a man who had been missing in the wreckage, the man whose staged death had been a rumor, but whose presence, if made public, would change the narrative entirely. For Yi, the return of Fu Tingyuan was not a fairy tale. It was a variable. She had assumed she would act without him. She had prepared to be necessary in light of his absence. But if he returned, his influence could either protect her or complicate the house's politics. Shen Feng had long suspected there was more to Fu Tingyuan's story than the household had been told. The resemblance between him and Shen Feng had made people whisper that the bodyguard could be some echo of the missing heir. The whispers were wrong in the way of gossip. What no one had known, what old Madam had withheld, and what Fu himself would reveal, was that the heir's death had been staged. He had not perished in the wreckage, but had disappeared deliberately, a shell left on the road as insurance for a deeper probe into corruption that had infected the company. He had gone undercover to assemble evidence. The plan had been secret, approved by only a handful. When the cover story leaked, when the car burned and the photos were public, some of those few believed he had been killed. That secrecy had become a hazard. What was meant to be a surgical removal of a problem turned into an exposed vulnerability. Fu's return was neither melodramatic nor clean. He came back when he had assembled enough evidence to withstand the scrutiny of his enemies. He arrived quietly in the house's east wing late one night, where Yi and Shen Feng were still at work poring over gesturing papers. He stepped into the lamplight with the purposeful manner of someone who had learned to disguise pain. For a long breath, Yi could not register shock. The man who had stepped into view was not the polished groom of portrait and invitation. He was thinner, his face more exact, like an artist who had trimmed and retouched until the lines told new truths. Fu Tinjuan's first words were not grand. "You handled the house well in my absence," he said, eyes on Ye. They were not accusation or praise. They were a measure. Ye wanted to remind him that in the world he had left, women like her had been tokens. Instead, she held a folder she had prepared weeks earlier and pushed it across the table to him. In it were photocopies of the evidence she had compiled against the smear, a timeline of incidents, witness statements, copies of the fake emails, receipts for the payments that had bribed servants and directors. It was her work, not because she wished to impress him, but because she wanted control. Fu skimmed the documents with the same clinical precision he applied to audits. His face was unreadable. Then he placed the USB she had given him on the table and slid it back to her. The tiny symbol of the lamplight, and winked. "You were careful," he said. "You went missing," Ye replied. "People died in your name. My life was made into an accessory to your secret." His mouth tightened. "You were supposed to leave." Ye laughed then, not mirthful, but incredulous. "Supposed to leave? No, I am not the kind to be dismissed by the word supposed. You chose to vanish. I had to survive your choices. I traded what I had." Fu's eyes softened. "I am not blind to the cost you bore." It was an acknowledgement that did not repair the past. It offered a sort of beginning. Ye allowed herself to see the man not as a ghost of an arranged alliance, but as someone whose return could be an ally or an obstacle. She needed to know what he knew. He listened as she described the attempts to discredit her and the black thread that led back to Fu Shengnan. He told her what he had discovered while gone: evidence of illicit transfers to shell companies, contracts signed under false pretense, and a small, dangerous ledger showing where moral compromise had become policy. He had faked his death to infiltrate deeper. He had withstood threats. He had compiled files too voluminous to be dismissed as conspiracy. Their goals overlapped but were not identical. She wanted to secure her place. He wanted to clean the house. The intersection was power. That was acceptable. They formed an alliance with clear terms. Ye insisted on a public transfer. She would not be shunted back into the shadows once his name returned to the papers. She would not be reduced to the story of the widow whose life had been an accessory to a man's experiment. Fu agreed, not out of romantic impulse, but because it was necessary for the legitimacy of the company. His return alone would not erase the stain of conspiracy. He needed the house to be credible. Having Ye as an acknowledged steward during his absence would look like continuity rather than cover-up. He offered, in a quiet, direct way, his public backing and a transfer of a small but symbolic share of his voting rights, enough to cement her position during the handover. But sealing that alliance would not be simple. Fu Shengnan, cornered, resentful, and dangerous, did not retreat when the facts stacked against him. Instead, he lashed out. He accelerated his smear campaign into something darker, an attempt to physically remove both Ye and evidence. The plot's apex came on a night when the family gathered ostensibly to mend fraying public relations. A banquet had been arranged to publicly reassure investors and partners. Cameras would attend, smiling faces would be expected. Ye arrived with a composure practiced since she had first woken in the borrowed body. The hall was gilded and smelled of citrus and strong perfume. Fu sat nearby, looking attenuated but composed. During dessert, a commotion arose near the terrace. A staged argument, the sort that comes from someone paid to startle, erupted. In the confusion, someone tried to slip Ye a cup of tea that had been prepared in a nearby service wing. Shen Feng, watching, intercepted it and recognized the presence of a foreign scent. He pushed the cup away with a hand that said more than words could. The cup shattered against tile, a neat, violent punctuation. The scream that followed was less of fear than of theatrical shock, exactly the kind of attention a conspirator would hope to manufacture. Security moved in, and in the scuffle, a man pushed toward an exit carrying a small box. Shen Feng pursued. In the corridor, the man tossed the box into a rubbish chute. Shen Feng dove, reaching for the box as documents fluttered like moths. By the time Shen Feng had the box, the man had vanished into a service exit. The box contained a recorder and a set of papers indicating that a hit had been planned to make Ye appear incapacitated at a public banquet, enough to ruin her credibility as interim steward and allow Fu Shengnan to seize control via a crisis narrative. It was the necessary piece of proof. It was also explosive in its consequences. The matriarch ordered immediate detentions, temporary for questioning, and the steward called in a neutral investigator. The tapes, the bribes, the receipts, they all began to point in one direction. The lines connected: Shengnan's men, a director's name, and the peripheral ledger the heir had been investigating before his disappearance. The elder family members were forced into a choice: protect their kin or protect their company. For many, the choice was not moral, but practical. They could not risk a public scandal that would decimate share price and ruin strategic partnerships. The matriarch, who had always chosen the house over the house's individuals, chose to act decisively. She authorized the temporary arrest of those implicated and demanded a full public board review. Fu Shengnan fought back with the ferocity of someone who had carved a throne out of others' fear. He painted himself as maligned, as a man the family's enemies had targeted. He demanded due process, demanded meetings, and tried to produce counter-evidence. It was, in essence, a duel across legal and social arenas. What broke his resistance was a collection of signatures, a ledger of bribes, unearthed from a safe deposit box belonging to a shell company that had been attached to his corporate account. Fu Tingyan had the ledger. Ye had the USB that held corroborating emails. Shen Feng had a witness, one of Shengnan's lieutenants, who, when confronted with the weight of isolation and the threat of legal consequence, decided to speak. The revelation was public and seismic. The board convened an emergency session and presented the evidence. Managers, investors, and the press listened as documents were placed on the table like the bones of a carcass. The chairman read a careful statement that Klein and Partners, an external auditor, had verified the chain of transactions. The company's legal department announced it would cooperate with law enforcement. Fu Shengnan was suspended pending investigation. It was a legal consequence, not a mob. Police were involved. There were interrogations and bail hearings and, finally, an arrest. The family watched as their blood, their history of compromise, was made into proofs and statements. For some, it was catharsis. For others, it was shame. Ye did not celebrate when the arrests were made. Her victory had never been an indulgence. It was simply a recalibration of power she had long planned. She had expected fury and revenge to follow, but she had not expected the exhaustion that accompanied vindication. It feels different to survive than to triumph. Fu Tingyan approached her after the board's decision. He had the quality of one who had seen a long journey with eyes that had become less certain of absolutes. "You turned a leverage into legitimacy," he said. "You are braver than I anticipated." She looked at him, and for a breath there existed between them the possibility of something other than negotiation. "You left," she said, blunt. "You left a lot of women to deal with your absence." "I know," he said, "and it cost too much." His apology had no theatricality to it. It was small and plain and honest. It did not ask for absolution. It asked for contact. Ye thought for a moment. "I traded what I had," she said. "I made a bargain. Don't pretend you haven't been part of the ledger." He listened. "I will support your position publicly," he said finally. "I will withdraw any claims that would reduce your authority during the interim. I want this house cleaned. I want those responsible to face the law." Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with measured appraisal. "And after it is cleaned?" "After?" He hesitated. He was not a man of many puffed promises. "After," he caught himself, "after, I will not force you into anything." Her laugh was small. "That's not a bargain you can offer me." "No," he admitted, "it is not." Their alliance was a contract of sorts, mutual benefit and measured restraint. He would act to restore legitimacy and would publicly back her interim stewardship. In return, she would not press him for private reconciliation. She would require only that he use his influence to make the house safe. The board voted to formally appoint Ye as acting steward for the deep-sea project. The market took the news with an immediacy that made the talented men at the trading houses whistle. Investors cheered, shares steadied, the contracts with Shang-Chi and Mr. Chen were signed under the interim authority Ye held. Mr. Chen released a public note praising Fu Group's resilience. The public expected that a cleaned house could continue to deliver. In the weeks that followed, Ye found herself in a new rhythm. She attended briefings, sat in designs meetings, learned the contours of balance sheets, not as a novice, but as someone who wanted to understand how to defend what she had claimed. Shen Feng continued to watch the edges of her life with the same careful vigilance. Fu Tingyuan was present more often than the matriarch might have expected, a man intent on making amends through action rather than rhetoric. Ye's transformation did not happen overnight. Her abilities were not a sudden genius, but a series of steady learnings, a negotiation with a director to restructure a clause, a meeting where she used her knowledge of antique appraisals to detect a forged asset, a phone call that secured a subcontract by asking the right question at the right time. She relied on allies, Old Madam's institutional knowledge, Shen Feng's network of protection, and Fu's behind-the-scenes clout. She also relied on her own calculation. There were tender moments too, quiet ones that did not make the papers. Shen Feng taught her how to hold a gun safely, not for the purpose of violence, but so she would know the shape of fear and how to meet it. Fu shared with her the private ledger of his father's past mistakes, explaining how a man's arrogance had been both a fuel and a curse. Ye, in turn, taught Fu to be less certain of his certainties. They argued like co-conspirators about ethics and strategy. Each conversation polished a shared respect that did not need to be declared as love to be meaningful. It took time for the house to settle. Old resentments cooled only as practical matters required seatings and signatures and reconciliations. The younger members of the family, Fu Huajiao and Fu Yuan, grew to admire Ye not as a scandal, but as a leader who could shepherd a project through a crisis. They visited more often, with less childishness and more curiosity. The final legal resolution arrived on an ordinary morning. Fu Shengnan was indicted on charges including bribery and conspiracy. The trial was not a spectacle, but a sober accounting, with witnesses and ledgers and cross-examination. He received the consequences of his actions: public censure, removal from active posts, and probationary oversight by the company until he demonstrated contrition, in part because Old Madam wanted the house not destroyed but reformed. A month after his suspension, the board gathered to ratify a restructuring. Fu Tingyuan proposed a formal transfer. He publicly assigned a portion of his voting rights to Ye, not as charity, but as a practical step to cement the house's stability while investigations concluded. The gesture was symbolic and crucial. It would deter further attempts to dislodge her legally. He signed in front of cameras and lawyers. He did not kneel. He did not grovel. He simply acknowledged where power and trust now rested. Ye accepted the shares and the responsibility with the same measured grace she had used throughout, as a steward of both profit and people. She did not seek revenge against the family who had traded her. She sought to be not an avenger, but a reformer. She proposed internal audits, protections for staff against coercion, and transparent channels for complaints. Her initiatives were practical: a hotline, an anonymous reportal system, and external audits, not mere theatrical scaffolding, but systems that could survive her absence. The matriarch, who had watched this process with the cool satisfaction of one who had seen many houses rebuilt, offered Ye something no one else had: a seat on the advisory council in perpetuity. "You are not ours only by circumstance," she said once in a private moment. "You are ours because you chose to work with us." Ye thought of her father and stepmother, of the mattress and the off-brand incense. She thought of the ledger entries where her name had once been a number. She had been traded and traded again. She had learned to trade back. The story could have ended there, with a redistribution of votes and legal settlements and a woman turned CEO by the force of public vindication. But the human heart does not always follow the corporate arc. There were softer reconciliations to make and a private life to rebuild. In the quiet months that followed the trial, Fu and Ye found themselves in a new, unadvertised relationship. It was not a romance sprung from rescue. It was a partnership that had been forged in mutual calculation and necessity and had softened into something else. He did not demand her submission. She did not require his protection. They formed a mutual respect and a private intimacy that involved late-night conversations about budgets and childhood, about the awkwardness of being arranged and the strangeness of choosing. There were moments of humor. Fu being surprised to find that Yi could refute appraisers using nothing more than a casual question. Yi being startled at how much Fu loved the sea and how intimately he knew the coastal projects now under their charge. Shen Feng teased them once, half sarcastic and half pleased, about how many boardroom victories translated into quiet dinners. He kept his distance, intimate in his way and content to be present. When Yi learned she was pregnant, an unexpected development that announced itself in a narrow, private way, she felt something that was not just personal but declarative. It was an affirmation of life, of continuity, of a future that did not repeat the architectures of the past. She told Shen Feng first in the garden where the moon had once found them plotting. He reacted with a dry, honest delight. "You planned everything with such delicious precision," he said. "You are incorrigible." "And stubborn," she said. "You're a good bargain maker," he said. Her next conversation with Fu was more complicated. He listened while she articulated boundaries. She would not accept a marriage as a cessation of autonomy. If they were to be partners, she insisted on mutual respect, legal clarity, and equal participation in parenting. She wanted a life where decisions were made together, not decreed. Fu agreed. He offered no grand declarations, but he offered everything he had learned about being accountable. "I will not put you in a ledger again," he said simply. "I will try to deserve your trust." Trust is not a single act, it is 1,000 small ones. Yi accepted the terms in the way she had accepted the board's vote, carefully, with catalogued reasons, and with the intention to hold everyone accountable. The house settled into a new pattern. The projects resumed, the contracts fulfilled, and the employees resumed their work without the shadow of illicit interference. Old Madam, who had watched so many cycles of fracture and repair, smiled at Yi's competence with a grandmotherly sternness. "You never were small," she said once, folding her hands. Yi's father, brought to the hearings as a witness, had to answer for his own part. He apologized with the weakness of a man who had been shaped by small mercies and larger cowardice. He would not be the pillar she needed. He would simply be a man who had a child who had chosen better. Lin Man and Cao Cao retreated into the obscurity of damaged social standing, their plots and pronouncements receding like small angry eddies. In the final days of what had been a long storm, Yi stood in the boardroom with the USB now stored in a safe whose access was institutional, not personal. She had learned that keys worked best in the concrete world, not the romantic one. She had secured the dowry, done right by her family, and presented a new governance model that would prevent the house from swallowing its own. The public narrative settled. The public narrative settled. The widow who had been scorned became the steward who had saved a house. She was given a title that satisfied both the market and the matriarch's love of order: acting steward and executive director for the Deep Sea Initiative. The press favored the practicality of the story. Commentators called it a story of resilience. They wrote less about the private bargains, the nights where Ye mapped out cash flow with Shen Feng perched in a corner as if he were the guardian of a more human ledger, about the meals where Fu apologized in small, practical ways, about the hush of the nursery where two planners imagined a life that was not arranged by anybody else. On a particular evening, as winter leaned into spring, the family gathered in a smaller room to acknowledge the beginning of the next phase. Old Madam raised a glass. "To continuity," she said. Ye felt more than continuity. She felt a claim, not merely to power or to a seat, but to a life she had chosen. She had refused the role of victim. She had turned a dowry and a small piece of metal into a legitimacy that could not be easily stolen. Fu stood beside her and, when the crowd's chatter quieted, reached for her hand. It was not a public claim to ownership, but a private pact. We will be partners, not proprietors. Later, when they retired to a private balcony, Fu asked the question that many men never bother to ask, because most men arrange, not ask. "Do you want to marry me?" he said. The words awkward because they had been practiced and unpracticed in equal measure. Ye regarded him with the measured calculation that had become her default. "Do you want to bind power to etiquette?" she asked. "No," he said. "I want to bind my life to yours. I want us to choose each other." She let silence answer for a heartbeat, and then nodded. "Then we will make an agreement," she said. "Equal terms, clear boundaries, and no bargains that erase me." He smiled, small, genuine. "I would prefer a life where bargains are unnecessary." "Me too," she said. When they married, if one could call their later legal union a wedding in the old sense, it was not the theater of an arranged alliance. It was a ceremony that acknowledged past wrongs and new obligations. Old Madam presided, with the matriarch's approval stamped on it, and Shen Feng stood at a discreet distance, the sort of presence that had, in the end, protected more than one person in the house. The nephews clapped with the honest enthusiasm of those who had seen a woman rise and who had, in the rising, learned new possibilities. The final scene of their arc was not triumphalist. It was quieter. Ye sitting at a small table, her hand on a child's tiny sock she folded into neatness, a folder of project projections open on the table, and Fu opposite her, reading the latest budget adjustment, while Shen Feng checked the perimeter with a detached but protective view. The house had changed, so had she. Yi had been offered into a marriage and had refused the passive part. She had calculated the worth of what she had been given, the dowry and the USB and the few allies, and had converted them into power. She had turned a forced exchange into agency, refusing to be merely an object in a ledger. She had used what she had been given to change the game. The last sound of the story, for a while, was simple: the small, decided slap of a child's laughter echoing down a corridor that had once only known the hush of deals. Outside, the city moved on. Investors called, projects continued. But inside the Fu house, a different economy now thrived. The economy of chosen life and careful love. Of people who learned that agency could be bought at such a price as prudence and courage. Yi sat back and let herself consider how far she had come. She had been traded, silenced, and nearly erased. She had refused to be that figure on a paper invitation. She held the key, not as a talisman, but as a contract she would honor and enforce on behalf of those who could not yet speak for themselves. She had rejected the idea that a life could be decided for her. The house had been saved. The projects were safe. The men who tried to destroy her were exposed. And in the quiet fold between legalities and human tenderness, Ye Wanxing finally chose her life, on her terms. If anyone had asked her then whether the calculus had been worth it, she would have smiled and said that survival alone was not the point. The point had been to shape a life that could withstand being measured, and to make sure that measurements counted for people, not only for profit.